It is now officially 3 full years since Russia launched its special military operation into Ukraine. And while the collective West still depicts this military operation as an unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine, in reality, looking at history objectively, taking information from only the Western media, we can see that it was actually in response to years and years of NATO expansion, NATO encroachment up to and all along Russia's borders, the US interfering in and overthrowing the governments of sovereign nations, replacing them with client regimes that answered to Washington rather than to the people of those actual countries, and then militarizing these countries to literally attack Russia. This has already happened, and it was happening again in Ukraine, but on a much larger and more dangerous scale. This is what Russia was responding to. And I am going to go over a timeline that I posted on X and on Telegram, and the links to where you can find and follow me on those platforms are in the video description below. And the purpose of showing you this timeline is not simply to review history, to try to understand it better. This is actually about discerning where this conflict is going to go next. Many people have high hopes that the United States has suddenly and inexplicably changed its mind about pursuing global dominance. It wants a seat at the multipolar table, and it's ready to make peace with all of its enemies. Unfortunately, we've heard this all before. And every single time the US says this, it is to buy time, to carry out even more aggression in just a matter of time. So I will go over this timeline to demonstrate a precedent, and then I will go over the actual evidence regarding the foreign policy of this current US administration under now President Donald Trump. So let's look at the timeline again very quickly. Clinton co-signs Budapest Memorandum, enshrining Ukrainian neutrality, 1994. And when I say neutrality, I think it would be more accurate to say neither Russia nor the US and NATO were to interfere in Ukraine's internal political affairs. It was to be left alone. Neither nation was to coerce it economically, politically, or militarily. And if you look at the Budapest Memorandum, the actual text, you can see that respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, refrain from economic coercion designed to subordinate to their own interests the exercise by Ukraine of the rights inherent in its sovereignty, and thus to secure advantages of any kind. Now, that's what it said in this agreement that the United States and Russia both signed. Tell me how the US upheld its side of the deal. If we look at this from The Guardian, 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. Does this sound like the United States was respecting the sovereignty and political independence of Ukraine? They're talking about the ongoing protests in 2004, which repeated themselves again in 2014. They admit that the campaign out in the streets is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries, not just Ukraine, 4 countries in 4 years has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. And all of this is just a euphemism for US political interference in another nation's internal political affairs. It admits, funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and 2 big American parties, and US non-government organizations. The campaign was first used in Europe and Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. They overthrew the government, and they installed a client regime in its place that answers to America, not to the Serbian people. Richard Miles, the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, and by that they mean 2003, as U.S. ambassador in Tbilisi, he repeated the trick in Georgia, and that's when they installed Mikhail Saakashvili into power. And then they were doing it in 2004 in Ukraine, and that is what the entire article is actually about. So this is a clear violation of the Budapest Memorandum. This was taking a sovereign, independent nation and transforming it into a client regime of the United States. Worse than that, a militarized proxy aimed straight at Russia. And Russia had real reason to be concerned because, as they mentioned, they also overthrew the government of Georgia in 2003. From 2003 to 2008, the United States reshaped the Georgian army. This is from Stars and Stripes. This is from 2005. As the process was ongoing, U.S. forces helped Georgian army make big changes. The United States and other countries offer training and equipment to the former Soviet Republic. They were also reshaping the organization of the force, building up non-commissioned officer corps, all of the things that we can look back at and recall the U.S. also did in Ukraine from 2014 to 2022 when Russia finally launched its special military operation. Now, the U.S. was militarizing and de facto NATOizing Georgia. The United States also, despite having assured Russia that NATO would not constantly expand, and even signing agreements that they would respect the sovereignty of these neutral countries. By 2008, this was April of 2008, Bush backs Ukraine and Georgia for NATO membership. And then later that year, 2008, Georgia attacked Russian peacekeeping forces, precipitating the 5-day Russian-Georgian war. And this is a Reuters article from 2009, a year later. Georgia started war with Russia, EU-backed report. An independent report blamed Georgia for starting last year's 5-day war with Russia. Saakashvili, which we remember, The Guardian admitting the U.S. installed into power in Georgia in 2003, had said Georgia was responding to an invasion by Russian forces. And this is a lie that is still repeated to this day all across the Western media. However, the report found no evidence of this because Russia did not invade Georgia. Georgia attacked Russia, as was always the plan. That was the whole purpose of overthrowing the Georgian government, militarizing its armed forces, and then unleashing them on Russia. And then from 2014 onward, the US did the exact same thing to Ukraine. But before we get to that, let's talk about what happened after the 5-day Russian-Georgian war, Russia obliterating these US trained and equipped Georgian forces. The shock in Washington that Russia would actually respond forcefully to continued U.S. encroachment. At that point, the U.S. had hit a brick wall in this encirclement, containment, and eventual absorption of Russia. So what did the U.S. do? The U.S. needed to buy time, and they did that by claiming they wanted peace with Russia. And you may recall this. After meeting Russian Foreign Minister, Clinton hails fresh start.
Today, in anticipation of this important meeting and our time here together, I wanted to present you with a little gift which represents what President Obama and Vice President Biden and I have been saying. And that is, we want to reset our relationship. And
let's do it together.
So we will do it together, okay?
Smiling ear to ear, they had a physical restart button that they both pushed together to signify new relations, a new chapter in US-Russian relations. But of course, it was all an illusion. And we can just look at the language from that period in time. We think this is a fresh start, not only to improve our bilateral relationship, but to lead the world in important areas, particularly with respect to nuclear weapons and nuclear security, Clinton told a joint press conference with Lavrov after the two met at a luxury hotel in Geneva. Tell me how that is any different than what current US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said after meeting also Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia recently.
Together with those other two, is beginning to engage in identifying the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to a acceptable end, the credible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest and frankly economically on issues that hopefully will be good for the world and will also improve our relations in the long term between these two important countries.
But the reset, again, was just a ploy to buy time, to get Russia to lower its guard, to make concessions that it otherwise wouldn't have if there was no peace offer or restart lended to them. The US in 2014 finally successfully overthrew the government of Ukraine. And then they began the same process that they went through with Georgia. They began militarizing the country under President Donald Trump. They began actually arming Ukraine with lethal aid. And the purpose of all of this was to precipitate a proxy war the US could use to extend Russia. We know that because there's literally a policy paper titled Extending Russia from 2019 published by the Rand Corporation. If you read the reports, it was commissioned by the US Army, and it is meant to advise the US government in foreign policy. And in the table of contents, under geopolitical measures, it says provide lethal aid to Ukraine as measure number 1. You can also see increased support to the Syrian rebels, promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia, challenge Russian presence in Moldova. Every single one of these recommendations has been attempted or are ongoing right now as we speak. So are all of the economic measures: hinder petroleum exports, reduce natural gas exports, hinder pipeline expansion. The US literally blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And that was after President Trump, during his first administration, began placing sanctions on the pipeline while it was under construction. And that it included on European companies as well as Russian companies. So I hope you can see where I'm going with all of this. This is why Russia reacted. They could see that the exact same process the US went through with Georgia was now taking place in Ukraine with a much larger population, much more powerful military to begin with, and then a military from 2014 to 2022 that was constantly getting larger, was better organized, was receiving more and more equipment and also weapons under the Trump administration, weapons from the US. It was becoming an unignorable threat to Russian national security. And Russia launched its special military operation. Just as they responded to the threat posed by Georgia, they were responding to the same threat the US created in Ukraine. And this was a threat that was created over the course of the Bush, Obama, Trump, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now here we are with another term with President Trump in office. So for the last 3 years, I have covered the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, and I have laid out the fact that it is a war of attrition that Russia is winning. The US has exhausted its arms and ammunition it had to spare for Ukraine. It is incapable of expanding the production of arms and ammunition quickly enough to sustain Ukraine's fighting capacity. And so the US has once again hit a brick wall. They are at an impasse, and what they need is not peace. There's no evidence or precedent of wanting peace. They need time. They are trying to buy time. And just as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton did back in 2009 with the reset, we see under the Trump administration a new reset being offered to the Russians. And just like the one in 2009, this is a ploy to buy time. And I can only surmise that Russia would ever accept such a deal if they also desperately needed to buy time, and they felt, honestly, they could use that time better than the Americans and the Europeans. That is the precedent. That is the precedent that we have indicating American intentions from this point onward. What about the actual evidence. Now, a lot of people are imagining that something has suddenly changed. Not only has the Trump administration openly, publicly stated that they are just buying time. Do you recall this from U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, President Trump's Secretary of Defense? This is what he said in Brussels.
We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. We ask each of your countries to step up on fulfilling the commitments that you have made. And we challenge your countries and your citizens to double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base.
How do you listen to that and draw the conclusion that the U.S. actually wants some sort of lasting peace or conclusion to this conflict, and that they're not just trying to freeze the conflict using the Europeans while they need to pivot to Asia and address a rapidly rising China? The very fact that the U.S. is openly saying they need to pivot to China, they need to end the conflict in Ukraine because they need to pivot to China, tells you that nothing has actually fundamentally changed about U.S. foreign policy. It's still pursuing global dominance. It has lost the proxy war in Ukraine. It needs to buy time, and it needs to address China first and foremost. And then once that is completed, they will circle back to Russia, just as they have done all throughout this timeline that I've showed you, from 1994 all the way up to 2025. 2 full cycles have been completed where the U.S. pushed extreme aggression and encroachment on Russia, reached a brick wall, resetted, and then began the process all over again. 2 full cycles now, and now we are preparing to enter the 3rd. And then we remember after Secretary Hegseth made his comments in Brussels, there was about a week or so where the United States, President Trump, Vice President Vance, Elon Musk, all took turns berating and belittling and insulting and mocking Europe, and Europe in turn stomped its feet and held its breath. But after about a week of what is in actuality just theater, Europe complied to Secretary Hegseth's directives 100%.
I can announce that a new 3.5 billion euro payment for Ukraine will arrive already in March. Second, as President Costa just has announced, there will be a special European Council, and I will present at this special European Council a comprehensive plan for defense investment, for scaling up our European arms production and defense capabilities, but also for investment in Ukraine's defense industry, scaling up your arms production, your defense capabilities. So this will be a plan for the European Union and for Ukraine.
So U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth tells Europe they're going to expand arms shipments to Ukraine. They're going to literally double down on Ukraine. They're also tasked with expanding their military industrial production. And that is exactly what the EU has now announced they are doing. The US told Europe what to do, and then Europe did it. We have 2 documents. We have Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation. This is yet another corporate financier-funded think tank that reflects the consensus of extremely powerful unelected special interest corporations, financial institutions, arms manufacturers, big pharma, big ag, big tech, the banking sector. They fund think tanks like this because despite it being a small percentage of the American population, less than 1%, there are still a lot of people involved, and they need to arrive at consensus, and that is what they do inside these think tanks. The think tanks arrive at this consensus, and it takes the form of these policy papers, and I've had people dismiss the importance of these policy papers. These are the blueprints that guide U.S. foreign and domestic policy. It is a extremely large nation state. Policy making does not just happen in the head of the president. It is institutionalized. It takes place over a large network of institutions. And the think tank papers, as you can see in regards to the conflict in Ukraine and the wider strategy of encircling and containing Russia, this Rand Corporation paper, every single measure laid out in this paper has been implemented. That is not a coincidence. That is evidence that these are the blueprints U.S. administrations, regardless of political party, are drawing from to determine their actions. So going to Project 2025 and looking at the Department of Defense, Russia is mentioned 23 times, and it is not referred to as a potential partner to move forward together in world peace, as Secretary of State Marco Rubio was trying to imply. The United States and its allies face real threats from Russia, as evidenced by Vladimir Putin's brutal war in Ukraine. We heard U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Brussels talking about a division of labor between Europe and the United States. Europe is going to freeze the conflict in Ukraine, double down on Ukraine. He literally said, double down on Ukraine, while the US pivots toward China, pursuing the exact same campaign of encirclement and encroachment on China. He did not just come up with that. And this was not an idea that just popped up in President Donald Trump's head, that he told Secretary Hegseth to go tell Europe in Brussels. This is from this Project 2025 paper, and it says right here, U.S. allies must also step up, with some joining the United States in taking on China and Asia, while others take a more of a lead in dealing with threats from Russia in Europe, Iran, the Middle East, and North Korea. A division of labor, right there. And if you look at all of the policies proposed in Project 2025, you will see virtually every single one of them has been announced by the Trump administration. If you go through this paper, everything that we hear the Trump administration talking about right now, behind the podium, at his desk in the Oval Office, or out of the mouths of his Secretary of State or his Secretary of Defense, you will find in Project 2025, this building of a massive missile defense system. That was in Project 2025. This obsession with China's nuclear expansion, considering the huge disparity that currently exists between the US and its large number of nuclear weapons and China's relatively small number of nuclear weapons. Also considering the fact that the US is the only nation in human history to use nuclear weapons against another nation, not once, but twice. Counter China's Belt and Road Initiative globally. Returning the US military to a force that can achieve deterrence or win in a fight if necessary requires returning to a threat-based defense strategy. This is something US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is saying. Enhance warfighter development, eliminate politicalization, reestablish trust and accountability, and restore faith to the force. And this is in reference to what they're calling Marxist indoctrination and divisive critical race theory programs. And this is what the Trump administration has been doing in regards to DEI and all of these other programs that they say at US aid but also eliminated from the US military. So as you can see, Project 2025, if it is not a verbatim blueprint for the Trump administration, the vast majority of it is being drawn from by the Trump administration. Again, these policies do not form in a vacuum. They form across a network of institutions. Project 2025 of the Heritage Foundation, funded by some of the largest corporate financier interests in the United States, is one of these networks, one of these institutions. The next is America First agenda, establish an America First foreign policy. And I remember right after President Trump won the election, and I pointed out how all of this serves continuity of agenda, no real break from what President Biden did before this current administration, what the first Trump administration pursued, what the Obama administration pursued for 8 years. I pointed out how all of this is continuity of agenda, and people said this isn't necessarily his policies, but as a matter of fact, they are. And you can see that that is exactly what he has done. In particular, in the European theater, reimpose defense ties with nations that have met or exceeded their 2% NATO GDP commitments and have demonstrated clear alignment of vision and resources with America's in terms of countering communist China and addressing the threat from Russia. That is exactly what U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said in Brussels. That is what he was talking about. Here, under maintain the world's most powerful military force, not something you're doing if you're talking about pivoting toward multipolarism away from global domination. Ensure the DoD budget reflects the military's core missions of deterrence and warfighting. Again, this is all Secretary Hegseth talks about. Repair recruitment challenges by investing in service members and eliminating divisive departmental policies like DEI, for example. The threat from communist China. Conduct an agency-wide review to determine the capabilities needed to prepare for and deter communist China. And of course, they have a whole section regarding China itself. Hold China, communist China, fully accountable for chronic unfair trade practices, stealing American technologies, and polluting our planet's air and oceans. And all of this is absurd. It is absolutely absurd. The PRC has the largest army and largest naval fleet in the world. They also have the largest population in the world. So it is proportional to the size of their nation. They are 4 to 5 times larger than the US in terms of population. Why shouldn't they have a larger navy and army than the United States, especially considering the large number of US troops, tens of thousands of them, located closer to China than to America's own shores? It seems only like a logical, rational response to a very real and persistent threat. And those are the so-called facts, but their solution is to just double down on why China is reacting this way in the first place. Beijing's official policy to reunify with Taiwan, including via military invasion if necessary. Taiwan is already recognized as part of China, even according to the US government itself. On the US State Department's official website, in 1972, the United States agreed with China regarding the status of Taiwan. And if you come down here, unambiguously, the US side declared the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. That is where the one China policy comes from. The United States government does not challenge that position. What a lot of people will do is say the US is simply acknowledging that that is Beijing's position, that Taiwan is part of China. But they never agreed that Taiwan is part of China. They just agree that that's what China says. However, the second part makes it unambiguous. The United States government does not challenge that position. That is what the US agreed to, and this is the agreement the US is reneging on. To the extent that they are arming the administration they installed into power in Taipei, and they are preparing to declare Taiwan independent of China despite international law recognizing Taiwan as part of China and America's own bilateral agreements with China recognizing Taiwan as part of China. And if you go to the US State Department's website right now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's Department of State, as of February 2025, they rewrote their explanation The original text very explicitly said, we do not support Taiwan independence. This new explanation omits that statement. However, it still says the United States has a long-standing one China policy, and they are referring to the Shanghai Communique, which I just read to you from here from 1972. So this is Secretary Rubio deliberately backtracking on America's own agreement with China over Taiwan. At the end of the day, no matter what you think you know about Taiwan, what is for sure is that it is on the other side of the planet from the United States. It was never any of America's business to begin with. The fact that the US is so deeply involved in this island right off the coast of the rest of China is at face value. It shows you who the actual problem is, who's creating this problem. And it is a problem that is continuing under the Trump administration unabated. And it is this mindset that demonstrates with absolute certainty that nothing has fundamentally changed. The US is not pursuing peace with Russia or China. They have run into a brick wall and they need time. Their policy papers talk about global domination, talk about confronting and containing Russia and China. All of the policies that are required to do so are already being implemented, even out of the other side, even when out of the other side of their mouth, President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth are saying they want peace with Russia. They want to end the war. It is all lies. And the policy papers are the evidence, and this cycle of history that we have now watched perform 2 complete revolutions is the precedent. Precedent and evidence are telling you that the US is disingenuous about peace with Russia and is determined to continue confronting China. And all of this is based on lies. Russia and China are not threats to the United States. What they are doing that is characterized as aggressive is merely a reaction to decades and decades of continuous US encroachment along their borders and even interference within their borders. For people who are going to insist that, well, maybe those think tanks are saying these things and maybe the Trump administration is pursuing these policies, but these are not the same policies as, say, the Rand Corporation, Brookings, CSIS, or the Neocon Institute for the Study of War. However, I'm going to play you some clips from this. This was from the US House Armed Service Committee. This was from February 12th, so just earlier this month. Protecting American interests in a convergent global threat environment. And right here is the official page for this discussion. And who were the witnesses at this hearing? General Jack Keane, retired, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, and Dr. Mara Karlin, professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And wouldn't you know that these obvious neocons promoting American primacy over the planet, everything that they're saying overlaps with these other policy papers that President Trump's administration are drawing from. This Project 2025 and this America First agenda, the America First Institute. Let's listen.
China is investing heavily in its military and threatening to outpace the United States. The Russian army is larger today than it was before the conflict. North Korea has doubled down on expanding its nuclear capabilities. The Ayatollah continues to harbor nuclear ambitions. They're building an alliance dedicated to countering American interest.
The barbarians are at the gate here, all right?
If you're wondering how effective AUKUS is, I would just note that China hates it. So that's a really nice piece of criteria for us to judge it by, particularly because it is bringing together a close European ally and a close Asian ally to work together in terms of how we're using our militaries, practicing that use, and potentially, if there were a contingency, one could imagine our militaries cooperating.
Let me just say, make a point about allies and partners. I think the last 2 administrations both have strengthened the relationships we've had facing these threats that are so real to us. NATO has obviously been strengthened. You can make the case that Putin may have more to do that than anybody else, but both administrations played a role in doing it. Certainly the Abraham Accords, both administrations have supported it. President Trump repurposed Quad, and President Biden strengthened it. And AUKUS was a novel, imaginative program that's going to pay great dividends for us in the future for the reasons well stated here.
China has the largest Navy in the world by numbers. I would argue their ships are much, much more impressive today than they were a decade ago. Also, if you look at their total production capacity, they can build 232 ships for every one ship that we build. If you take all of our shipyards, put them together on a geographic footprint, they would not fill the geographic footprint of the largest of the 13 Chinese shipyards. If you look at where they are today, they're on track to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, with no nuclear arms limitation treaty in sight. I want to look at what can we do in the short term to be that deterrent force. How can we take what is an asymmetric advantage, with us being the best creators and innovators on the earth, with us building expendable and attritable systems at the same pace that we see happening elsewhere in places like Ukraine? How do we close that gap?
We know our surface ships are vulnerable to hypersonic swarming weapons, and if we use them, most of them are going to go away. And we know full well that our bases in the Pacific are vulnerable to long-range offensive weapons.
How do we drive a wedge? How do we keep this convergence or this excess of aggression from forming even stronger? So if we go back 5 years, it was very different. How do we drive that wedge from it continuing to progress the way it is? Why don't we start with you, Dr. Carlin?
We look at how to drive a wedge and see these limits. Who's dying right now for Russia? As far as I can tell, it is only some North Koreans. I don't see Chinese or Iranians dying for them. That's actually very different than the United States. We have tens and tens of allies who, throughout history, but especially in the post-9/11 wars, have been willing to do so. So I think highlighting those sorts of wedge issues can be really worthwhile, showing that, showing the Russians that actually this partnership with China isn't worth all that they think it is, or this partnership with Iran, that it has some real challenges as well.
All the elements of national power have got to come into play here. And obviously we're competing with them economically, diplomatically, technologically, militarily, and geopolitically. We are making good progress, I believe, geopolitically with our allies and partners in the region. But there's more that we can do there. Technologically, I believe certainly that our democratic capitalism can beat their state capitalism, that we can outthink, outwit, and out-innovate these guys over time. And we have to unleash our commercial sector here to help us do just that. We have to fix our business practices in the Pentagon, and we have to hold the Pentagon responsible and accountable for that. And we certainly have to fix how we do business with the defense industrial base and also with our own organic industrial base. And I think the Congress has to take a tough look at itself in terms of how it does business with the Pentagon.
With regards to USAID, I believe that USAID does spend money to advance American interests, but I also believe that it spends money not to advance American interests. And I think that what's going on right now is just an auditing of that, getting rid of those things that do not advance American interests, and then keeping those things that do advance American interests. There's, the word regime change, or the two words regime change, seem to be dirty words, okay? People don't want to hear it. We shouldn't be doing that. I don't share that opinion. As a matter of fact, I believe that when we can, we should turn enemies into friends. And one of the things that we should be looking at right now is seeing what we can do with Iran. If we can turn Iran and we can have regime change, that would be, what would that do to that region, and what would that do for American security interests if we, in fact, were able to change the regime in Iran?
We have to work with our intelligence agencies. The Israelis, what they do inside of Iran is nothing short of remarkable.
Fair enough.
In the resistance groups, at just about every single one of their operations that they're conducting inside of Iran covertly are done with the cooperation of resistance groups. So there's a lot of things that we can do to assist this inside of Iran as well. And that the discussion should be, in a closed-door session with our intelligence services as to how we can assist that. But the general pressure that is on Iran and the problems they're having now, they have never had to this degree in the 40-plus years they've been in power.
Mr. Domino, who was just appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, has said that the Middle East, quote, does not really matter for U.S. interests, has argued that, quote, vital or existential threats in the Middle East are, quote, best characterized as minimal to non-existent. He also very concerningly characterized Iran's 2 missile attacks, unprecedented direct attacks on Israel, as, quote, fairly moderate, and described our strikes against the Houthis and our attempts to deter them as, quote, futile.
Well, certainly I fundamentally disagree with that position. And the last 2 administrations have both stated that we have 3 geographical areas where U.S. vital interests are at stake: the Indo-Pacific region, the Middle East, and Europe. And I find it hard to believe that the appointed Secretary of State Marco Rubio would hold that view.
Agree.
Or I find it hard to believe that the National Security Advisor Michael Waltz would hold that view. So the national security apparatus of any administration will always have people who have differing views. And that gentleman certainly is entitled to that. But I don't believe that will represent the consensus of the Trump administration's national security viewpoint. The Army itself, land forces, we've seen the Marines make some fundamental changes, and I know the Army is attempting to make fundamental changes to help deal with the war in China. When we look at the Indo-Pacific and think of it as an air and maritime theater, much of the land that surrounds the navigation routes are actually key terrain. And our World War II leaders understood that rather dramatically and used it as such. And we have to recognize that we can take advantage of that key terrain which accesses the navigation routes that the Chinese would be using. And we have to change the capabilities out there as well. We obviously don't need tanks out there because that kind of war is not going to be fought. It's an air and maritime theater enabled by land power, as war in Europe is a land power theater enabled by air power.
And this last part about the Marine Corps being reorganized, this is also mentioned in the Trump administration connected Project 2025 document. And there's also a process that has taken place over the last 4 years under the Biden administration. This was from February 2023, how U.S. Marines are being reshaped for China threat. Down here, it says the new plan sees the Marines as fighting dispersed operations across chains of islands. Units will be smaller, more spread out, and packing a much bigger punch through a variety of new weapons. Huge amphibious landings like World War II or massive deployments on land like in Iraq will probably be a thing of the past. General Keane specifically talked about no need for tanks, and isn't it interesting that under the Biden administration, all of the tanks were given up by the U.S. Marine Corps, and instead they began using anti-shipping missiles. And isn't it interesting, under the Project 2025 documentation, that is exactly what it talks about continuing to do. This is what I mean by continuity of agenda. Everything that we heard in this discussion here among establishment Democrats and Republicans, the so-called deep state, neocons and warmongers, including General Keane of the Neocon Institute for the Study of War, everything they said overlaps perfectly with the Trump administration's Project 2025 and the associated documentation. Precedent and evidence of continuity of agenda. Russia and China are threats. The U.S. must expand its military. It must deter China. When they say they're going to deter China, it simply means deter China from countering American encroachment upon China, encroachment and containment of China, and America's continued primacy over Asia. I hear a lot of people saying the U.S. is retreating. to the Western Hemisphere. That's why they're focusing on the Panama Canal and on Greenland, and also Canada for that matter. In reality, they're just trying to secure maritime passages that they will need to enact a global blockade on Chinese maritime shipping, which they have been preparing for years. The U.S. Marine Corps has prepared for the last 4 years. They have reorganized their entire force to serve as an anti-shipping force, rather than the expeditionary force they had existed as throughout their whole history. So this is something that is coming. It has momentum in and of itself. President Trump, his administration, the people he has once again surrounded himself with are dedicated warmongers, American exceptionalists, even neocons. And he did not surround himself with these people in a 5D chess move. He's doing it because, just like during his first administration, he's only telling you what you want to hear. And in reality, he is continuing to serve this continuity of agenda, just as every single president has before him, including himself during his first term in office. You have been warned. You can subscribe to wishful thinking if you want. You can lie to yourself. You can live in denial that this is what is really happening. But the precedent has been set. The evidence is there. The very policy papers President Trump is drawing from indicate continuity of agenda, not some sort of intention toward peace. We have seen this before. This is not unprecedented. The U.S. posing as wanting peace while preparing for more aggression, buying time to prepare for more aggression, has happened over and over and over again with many countries around the globe, including both Russia and China, and including under the previous Trump administration. I will continue covering what is actually happening and the source of this policy. I will continue going through it and showing it to you. I could only hope at a juncture in the very near future, people start to wake up. You are not going to will peace on earth into reality by simply going along with deliberate lies told by the US about pursuing peace. That is not how it works. I've actually had people tell me that. You are going to will peace on earth if you tell the Trump administration, we voted you into office to end all of this. Not pivot to China, not end one war in Europe and pivot to another war in Asia, not to hand the war over to Europe, not to fight another war in the Middle East against Iran. We said America first, not America empire first, America first. If the current administration really wanted to make America great again, it would turn inward and invest in America. It would start reforming education. It would make healthcare affordable for everyone. It would nationalize healthcare. It would nationalize arms production. It would take all of these corrupt, deeply entrenched monopolies. That is the deep state. It's not Democrats and liberals. It is unelected corporate financier interests. It's the people who helped pay for both President Trump and candidate Kamala Harris's campaigns. That's the deep state. That's what you need to dismantle. He's not even talking about doing it. If Americans want it done, they need to put pressure on the Trump administration to do that, not put their fingers in their ears and cover their eyes and pretend what they're seeing and hearing is not actually happening. It is happening. Things are going to continue in the same direction, and things are only going to get worse because there is a real problem. The Trump administration won't even speak of it, let alone do anything to actually solve it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all the places you can find and follow my work. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram, X. Also in the video description are all of the links that I referenced in this video. Every single article from 1994 all the way up to 2025 regarding this timeline that I went over. All of the policy papers that I referenced are there, and you should go look at them and read them for yourself. Also, the 3-hour hearing where we have verified neocons repeating the same policies points that the Trump administration is laying out and pursuing right now as we speak. Also in the video description below are all of the ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. Everyone who is helping support my work, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.